Teresa Lewis was born on April 26, 1969, to a poor textile mill working set of parents. As a young child, she didn't get into any type of trouble and even sang in her church choir. In her teens, she ended up meeting a boy at her church, and the two had a daughter together by the name of Christy Lynn Beam. Teresa was only 15 years old when she gave birth to Christy, and being that both families were involved in the church, they felt that the two marrying would be the best option, so Teresa married her first husband when she was just 16 years old. Teresa struggled academically, and the load was too much for her, so she ended up dropping out of high school and eventually got a divorce from her husband. Soon after the divorce, Teresa turned to alcohol and painkillers, but was still somehow able to raise and have custody of her daughter. Most likely due to the drinking and drug abuse, Teresa could not keep a job, and up until the age of 30, she had over 20 odd jobs that she was not able to keep. Finally, in the beginning of the year 2000 and at the age of 31, Teresa found a stable job working at the Dan River textile mill where she met her manager, Julian Lewis. The two began taking a liking to one another, and by mid-2000, the two had moved in together. Julian's wife had just recently passed away, so he was a widower with 3 kids by the names of Jason, Charles, and Kathy. Teresa brought along her then 16-year-old daughter, Christy, and the 6 of them lived together in Julian's home. Soon after moving in, Teresa married Julian. The following year, in 2001, Julian's eldest son, Jason, passed away in a car accident. Julian was able to receive about $200,000 in life insurance on his son, and with that money, he went to Pennsylvania County, Virginia, and bought a home that was stationed on 5 acres of land. The following year, in 2002, Julian's middle child, Charles, had joined the Army and was anticipating being deployed and fighting in Iraq. In preparation for the possible dangers, Charles decided to get a life insurance policy for $250,000 and designated his father Julian as the primary beneficiary and his stepmother Teresa Lewis as the second beneficiary. A few months later, Teresa Lewis began to devise her master plan. In late 2002, Teresa met 2 men at a local Walmart and began a sexual relationship with both men. One man was 21-year-old Matthew Schallenberger, whom she eventually fell in love with. The second man was 19-year-old Rodney Lamont Fuller. On October 23, 2002, Teresa gave Matthew and Rodney over $1,000 along with sexual favors in order for them to purchase guns and ammo that would be used to kill her husband Julian and her stepson Charles. Charles had actually just come home weeks earlier to visit from his Army training in Maryland. Teresa's plan was to collect the life insurance money on Charles, and in order to do that, she also needed the primary beneficiary to be gone. Matthew and Rodney attempted to kill Julian while driving in the community, but were unsuccessful. Just a week later, after the first attempt, on October 20th, 2002, Teresa's second plan came into fruition. Late in the evening, when it was time for everybody to go to bed, Charles went to his room and fell asleep. Julian and Teresa prayed and then laid down in the bed next to each other. In the middle of the night, though, Teresa opened their back door and then proceeded to the kitchen and stayed in the kitchen until the murders were complete. Not too long after she opened the back door, Matthew and Rodney came in at around 3:15 a.m. They were wielding guns, and Rodney went alone to Charles's bedroom and shot him with a shotgun. After noticing that the first shot did not kill him, Rodney Fuller shot him 2 more times with a shotgun. While Rodney was killing Charles, Matthew was in the other bedroom killing Julian. Teresa waited close to an hour before calling the police, and before she called them, she gathered $300 that was in her husband's wallet and split it amongst the 2 men. The sheriff's deputies were the first to the scene, but unbeknownst to Teresa, Julian was still clinging on to life, and the deputies were able to hear Julian's last words before he passed away. His last words were, "My wife knows who done this to me." His last words were being said while Teresa was in the kitchen telling responding deputies that the 2 unknown assailants killed her husband and stepson in a home invasion. No one was arrested that night, but within a couple of days, Teresa tried to withdraw $50,000 from her husband's bank account with a forged check, and less than a week after the murder, Teresa was brought in for questioning and confessed to everything. She told police about Rodney and Matthew, and there were 3 separate trials for the murders. For Teresa's murder trial, the judge believed that Teresa was the mastermind. During her trial, Teresa's attorneys wanted her to plead guilty to the murders. In order to avoid going to trial with a jury, in hopes that a judge would give her some leniency for cooperating and understanding her low mental IQ. A psychiatrist actually tested Teresa and found out that her IQ was a mere 72. Teresa's attorney was quoted saying, "She's not mentally retarded, but she is very close to it." Not only that, they found out that Teresa was still drinking and abusing drugs. She was diagnosed with dependent personality disorder, and despite this, Teresa chose to plead not guilty. She was sentenced to death in 2003 because in the state of Virginia at the time, if you murdered more than one person within a 3-year period, you were subject to the death penalty. So Mastermind Teresa was sentenced to death, but the 2 men who actually pulled the trigger got a lesser sentence. The men who did the killing received life in prison for their trials because they pled guilty. Christie was also sentenced, but to 5 years in prison because she was a co-conspirator and knew the murder was going to happen before it happened and did nothing to prevent it. After Teresa was sentenced, she was granted an automatic review by the Supreme Court of Virginia, and the review mentioned that it was unfair to execute Teresa while the other men got life sentences. Although it was a fair review, it was ultimately rejected. Teresa was put on death row at the Fluvanna Correctional Center for Women in Troy, Virginia, and she was the only woman in the state of Virginia on death row at that time. The following year, in 2004, a private investigator met with Matthew Schallenberger on behalf of Teresa, and the investigator transcribed what was being said, and Matthew was quoted saying, "Teresa was in love with me. She was very eager to please me. She was also not very smart." Matthew ended up tearing off the bottom of the transcribed affidavit with his signature on it and ate it. He then said, "What will happen will happen." A couple of years later, in 2006, Matthew unalived himself in his cell. As for the other murderer, Rodney Fuller, he went on record saying that he believed Matthew Schallenberger was the one in charge and not Teresa. They found out later that Matthew had an IQ of 113. While on death row, Teresa gained many followers and supporters who ended up sending over 7,000 appeals for a more lenient sentence to Governor Bob McDonnell. Teresa was also quoted pleading to the governor, "I just want the governor to know that I am so sorry, deeply from my heart, and if I could take it back, I would in a minute. I just wish I could take it back, and I'm sorry for all the people that I've hurt in the process." Governor Bob McDonnell declined to grant clemency. He stated that, having carefully reviewed the petition for clemency, the judicial opinions in the case, and the other relevant materials, I find no compelling reason to set aside the sentence that was imposed by the Circuit Court and affirmed by all reviewing courts on September 17, 2010. He decided not to stop Teresa's execution. Teresa's attorneys filed again to the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution on September 21, 2010, but they were again denied. 2 dissenting judges by the names of Ruth Ginsburg and Sonia Sotomayor mentioned that if they were the ones making the decision, they would have granted clemency. On September 23, 2010, it was time for Teresa's execution day at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. She spent the day praying and singing religious songs to herself. Her last meal consisted of peas, Dr. Pepper, 2 pieces of fried chicken breasts, and apple pie. Teresa Lewis was taken to the execution chamber and strapped in. Her stepdaughter Cathy Lewis was there to witness the execution, and Teresa actually asked if she was there. Knowing that she was, her last words were, "I just want Cathy to know that I love you, and I'm very sorry." Teresa was then injected with the lethal injection concoction, and her official time of death was at 9:00 p.m.
I know it's not been easy, but I want you to know that you are.
Among the first words the public has heard from Margaret Allen through her tears is that she's sorry for the murder of Wenda Wright. Allen said she shouldn't be put to death for something she didn't do.
Did you feel sorry when you said, "Thank God that's over"?
No, that's not true. I didn't do that. I didn't say that.
Your daughter talked about what you'd asked her to do. Go get some tape.
I wasn't never no killer, no murderer. I was always a loving, caring person.
Margaret Allen was born on January 23, 1966. In her late 30s, Margaret was living in an apartment with her roommate, James Martin, and her children. She had a housekeeper by the name of Wenda Wright, and Wenda lived in a house nearby with her boyfriend, Johnny Dublin. On February 8, 2005, Margaret noticed that her purse was missing. She left the house and asked Quentin to look after her children. Quentin was a young 19-year-old who happened to have the same last name as Margaret, but they were not related. Margaret considered Quentin to be like a nephew because she took him off the streets and cared for him. Margaret went to Wenda's house and was invited inside. She whispered something into Wenda's ear, and after the quiet exchange, Wenda left with Margaret. Johnny was inside of the house and witnessed everything that happened and saw his girlfriend Wenda leaving the house. Unfortunately, it would be the last time he would see Wenda alive. While back at her house, Margaret asked Quentin to help her look for her purse inside of the house. They were unable to find it, and she told Quentin that the only person who could have been the culprit was Wenda because she was the only person in the house before the purse went missing. Some time had passed and Margaret returned to Wenda's house. Before heading off to Wenda's house, though, she made Wenda stay at her house and told Quentin to keep her inside and not to let her leave no matter what. Wenda did try leaving once, but after Quentin told her that Margaret wanted her to stay, she agreed to stay put. Back at Wenda's house, Margaret spoke with Johnny and told him that Wenda stole about $2,000 from her and asked Johnny if he would be willing to allow her to look around the house for the money. Johnny was okay with her request, even though he thought it was odd that Margaret had scratches on her that weren't there the first time she came to his house that day. Margaret began searching the house, and Johnny asked where Wenda was. Margaret responded by saying that Wenda was at her house. Margaret's search resulted in nothing, and she went back home. Now back in the comfort of her own home, Margaret still did not allow Wenda to leave. She decided to let James braid her hair, which took some time, and Wenda began crying, asking to go home. Wenda's cries were ignored, and Wenda attempted to walk out of the house but was hit by Margaret. Quentin would later go on record and say that Margaret had a gun and threatened him by telling him that if he did not help her with Wenda, she would shoot him. Quentin agreed to assist Margaret by holding Wenda down, and while doing so, Margaret felt the need to pour whatever she could find on Wenda. She collected rubbing alcohol, hairspray, fingernail polish remover, and bleach. The noise was too much and abnormal, so one of Margaret's kids walked into the living room to see what was going on. Instead of telling them to go back into their room, she asked them for a piece of duct tape. Margaret then attempted to use the duct tape, but Wenda was wet from everything that was poured on her, so she settled for a belt. While being hurt and not fighting back, Wenda cried out, "Please stop, please stop. I'm going to piss myself." After a few minutes, Wenda was dead, and Margaret instructed Quentin to get some sheets to tie her hands in case she woke up. Wenda never woke up, but Quentin ended up leaving Margaret's house, and she continued to call him throughout the night, but he would not answer. The very next day, Margaret went to Wenda's house again and was greeted by Johnny. She asked him where Wenda was, but of course he had no clue. Margaret then went out into the community, and she found Quentin at a barber shop. Quentin noticed that Margaret still had a gun on her, so he left with her, got in her truck, and noticed that her roommate James was inside as well. Margaret then told Quentin that Wenda was dead and he needed to help her get rid of the body. The trio drove to a Lowe's store to purchase plywood so it would be easy to transfer Wenda from the house to the truck. They then drove to another shop in order to rent a dolly truck. After that stop, they drove back to Margaret's house where Quentin noticed that Wenda was now wrapped in a carpet. All three of them took part in transporting Wenda's body to the truck, and all three were equipped with shovels that they got from Margaret's mother's house. They drove to an area off the highway where they dumped Wenda's body and began digging a hole. Once they dug a hole that was big enough, they unwrapped Wenda from the carpet and placed her body inside of the hole. They kept a carpet so that they could throw it in a dumpster that was outside of the truck shop. Once they were done, they acted like nothing had happened and picked up one of Margaret's daughters up from school. Quentin, although close to Margaret and helping her with any request, could not take what had happened and ended up going to the police station to turn himself in later that day. Margaret was arrested 3 days later on February 11th. Margaret, James, and Quentin were all questioned. Quentin admitted everything. James said that he was not present when Linda died because he was outside working on Margaret's car. He said that he left at around 10 o'clock p.m. to get a starter belt for the car, and when he returned, he asked Margaret if she had any cocaine, and she replied by saying no. Because she was out of what he needed, James said that he left to go get cocaine and came back to the house and was high and unaware of anything that was going on inside of the house. He told detectives that he never saw Wenda or Quentin inside of the house. He stated that the next day he drove with Margaret in her car while she picked up her children from school, and she randomly told him that she needed help with something. He pinned every idea on Margaret and admitted that he followed all of her demands, which included cleaning out the truck and items inside of her house. When trial began, a crime scene technician testified that she exhumed Wenda's body and found a cigarette butt nearby. DNA was taken from that cigarette, and the DNA matched to James Martin. A neurological physician by the name of Michael Gebel testified on behalf of Margaret for the defense and confirmed that Margaret suffered from numerous head injuries, and between 1995 and 1996, she was treated for facial trauma, head trauma, and bite wounds. Margaret had also suffered from an overdose, and Dr. Gebel stated that she had significant intracranial injuries that lowered her intellectual capacity and brain damage that destroyed her impulse control. In a quote from a court document, Dr. Gebel said that her brain damage might affect her ability to appreciate the criminality of her conduct and that she would have difficulty conforming her conduct to the requirements of law. She would not be able to create a complex plan, and she lost the ability to control her mood, which is actually a reason why he could not determine whether or not she was substantially mentally impaired. She was just not cooperative, even with knowing that he was there to help her. Another doctor, Dr. Joseph Wu, who was a neuropsychiatry and brain damage specialist, testified during trial that Margaret had at least 10 brain injuries, with most of them being on the right side of her brain, which resulted in asymmetrical changes and changes in her frontal lobe. Damage to the frontal lobe specifically affects impulse control, judgment, and mood regulation. In another quote from a court document, Margaret's brain injuries would make it hard for her to conform her conduct to the requirements of society. He testified that she would have an overreaction to slight provocation, but that Margaret's injuries should not impair her planning abilities. Margaret's ability to understand and regulate proportionate responses in a consistent manner was significantly impaired. It would be difficult for her consistently to conform her conduct to the requirements of society. Aside from medical experts, some of Margaret's family members testified on her behalf as well. Margaret's Aunt Myrtle testified that life for Margaret was nothing but violence and drug-infested communities. From being assaulted by people she knew to men she was in relationships with, there was a constant cycle of bad situations she was in. Margaret's cousin Tara and sister-in-law April testified that they believed Margaret was a good friend and overall good person. She did sell drugs to provide for her children, but it did not make her a bad person. The only person related to Margaret that said her childhood was good was Margaret's grandmother, Irene Posey. Irene said that at times Margaret would come live with her. Despite what her grandmother said, Margaret testified and confirmed what others had said about her harsh upbringing and things she had to do to survive. She asserted that she did not kill Wenda, and even though her own daughter testified that she witnessed her mother Margaret kill Wenda, Margaret continued to deny the accusations and charges. At the conclusion of trial, Quentin Allen was sentenced to 15 years in prison with 5 years of probation for his guilty plea of second-degree murder. James Martin was charged with 60 months in prison for his involvement in hiding Wenda's body, and as for Margaret, with a unanimous decision, she was sentenced to death on May 19, 2011. Margaret Allen is currently on death row in Florida at the Lowell Annex Maximum Security Facility.
I'm angry about it, yes, but I forgive you.
A question I would like for you guys to ponder on while listening to the story. Do you think Raul and Cathy are equally responsible for the murders of Ricky and Conrad? It all started when Ricky and Conrad were born. They were born 2 years apart. Conrad was born in 1992 and Ricky was born in 1994. Unfortunately for the brothers, they were born into a family that statistically would make one assume that their upbringing and overall life would be bad, and/or they would turn out to be bad. Their father was absent from their lives, and their mother, Rosa Morales, was a drug addict who sold drugs in order to support her habit. Ricky and Conrad knew nothing but drug users and drug dealers. They were also subject to being physically assaulted and neglected. They were no strangers to Child Protective Services being involved in their lives, but doing nothing to protect them, and they also witnessed SWAT teams bust into homes they were staying in with their mother. CPS removed Ricky and Conrad out of Rosa's care multiple times, but despite her bad habits, they always returned to her until she was finally sent to prison on drug charges. It was late 2004, early 2005, and Conrad was sent to live with his mother's brother, or his uncle, Raul Sarinana. Raul was a convicted felon, and he was married to a woman named CATHY SARINANA. The two were living in Randall, Washington when they accepted Conrad into their home. Conrad's younger brother Ricky was sent to live with Rosa's mother, or his grandmother. Ricky was very vocal in not liking his new living situation. He told educators, "My life is not worth living." He was also caught writing "Die, Ricky, die" on his arm with a pen. CPS was called because his behavior was alarming. CPS acted and admitted Ricky into a psychiatric facility for treatment, and social worker Elia Godinez presided over Ricky's case. Eventually, Rosa was released from prison, but she was not stable enough to have any of her sons in her custody yet. Social worker Elia was quoted telling Rosa, "Conrad seems to be doing fine in Washington, so why don't you send Ricky to Washington too?" It wasn't a suggestion though, because Elia followed by saying, "You've got 1 week to send him to Washington, or I'm going back to court and your kids are going back into foster care." Hard to think that a convicted criminal would be a better guardian than Grandma, but within a week, Ricky was sent to Washington to live with his brother, his uncle Raul, his aunt Cathy, and their 2 children. Many thought that life was picture perfect for Ricky and Conrad, especially with Raul providing his family with updates that the brothers were thriving. He described them using extremely positive words. They were excelling in school, getting great grades, making so many friends, and even joined sports teams. Little did his family know, Raul was creating this false narrative to cover what was truly going on behind closed doors. Raul and Cathy were secretly physically and sexually assaulting Ricky and Conrad. After months of Ricky and Conrad living in a horrific home, more information was coming to light about their situation. Ricky and Conrad's sister Destiny Morales and Raul and Cathy's neighbors reported to authorities on different occasions that Ricky and Conrad were being assaulted. It also came to light that there was no way both boys could have been excelling in school because Ricky had not even been enrolled in school yet. Conrad was attending school, but he was far from excelling. He told his classmates that his uncle Raul had been hurting him, and he also started coming to school wearing makeup to cover injuries he had sustained on his body. After more reports alerting authorities about Ricky and Conrad, police finally notified CPS and a new investigation in Washington began. At the conclusion of CPS's investigation, they concluded that all allegations from every source were unfounded. Conrad and Ricky's words and marks on their bodies were not enough for CPS to act. Ricky and Conrad were scared and retracted statements they made to classmates or other people when questioned by CPS. They were instructed by Cathy to tell authorities and CPS that they had gotten into fights. After months of trying to get herself on the right track, Rosa was now prepared to bring Ricky and Conrad back to California to live with her. Unfortunately, Raul said that he was not able to afford airplane tickets and that they needed to stay with him a bit longer. A few months later, in October of 2005, Rosa continued to press Raul about airfare tickets, but this time, Raul and Cathy let Rosa know that Conrad had run away from home, and for a while, he had been acting out at home and school. They tried to reassure Rosa that they were doing everything they could to find Conrad, but it would be tough because they knew Conrad had run away with a gay lover who was much older and elusive. Mind you, Raul had been telling Rosa that he did not have enough money for airfare tickets to send Conrad and Ricky back to California, but Raul was now communicating to Rosa and his family that Cathy was so distraught about the disappearance of Conrad that he was going to fly Cathy and his 2 young children he had with Cathy to California to live with Rosa. Conrad, of course, was missing too much school, so CPS was contacted again, and there was a new investigation opened up. Little did Rosa and her family know, Raul and Cathy told social services that Conrad was not missing at all and moved with a different relative in another state. Social services believed the evil couple and closed their investigation. Raul tried to play off that he was a knight in shining armor. He said he would not leave Washington until he found Conrad. It seemed like Raul never kept his word because he and his family moved to Corona, California, but did not tell anyone of his new address. It was now Christmas Eve 2005. Ricky and Conrad's Aunt Bertha wanted to visit the family in Washington, and she was given an address from Raul. Maybe Raul did not think Bertha would really make the effort to visit, but she did. When she arrived at the address, she found out that it was a fake address, so she was stuck not being able to see Ricky or Conrad. When Christmas finally came around, Ricky called his Aunt Bertha and begged for her to take him. The family then started to make plans to bring Ricky home. Unfortunately, Aunt Bertha would be the last family member outside of Raul and Cathy to speak to Ricky ever again. By Christmas evening, Ricky lay dying in a closet after being physically assaulted. He was too weak to scream out for help and was suffering. It all started when Cathy had made some food, and Ricky said that he did not feel like eating. He was not feeling well because he had just been physically assaulted and was in too much pain to eat. Cathy was extremely offended that Ricky refused to eat food she felt she slaved in the kitchen for, so Raul demanded that Ricky clean one of the bathrooms in the house. Ricky was assaulted multiple times for not cleaning fast enough, and after the third hit, coming from the tip of a hard shoe connecting to Ricky's chest, he started to throw up. Raul was angered even more and assaulted him again before dragging him into the closet. Ricky tried to escape the feces-filled closet, but was assaulted even more and was too weak to attempt trying to leave again. The closet was a frequent punishment location where Ricky would have to stay inside for hours, and because of this, he would pee on himself, and Raul and Cathy made no attempts to clean the closet out. While Ricky was dying, Raul and Cathy had no care in the world and invited friends and some of Cathy's family over for a Christmas dinner. They had fun talking, eating, and enjoyed cheerful laughs with each other. None of the guests knew that they were feasting with killers. Hours later, when all of the guests had left, Cathy went to go check on Ricky but found him dead. She supposedly got scared and called 911, and he was pronounced dead late in the evening on December 25th, 2005. The very next day, on December 26th, Cathy and Raul were both brought in for questioning by the Corona police. Raul admitted to assaulting Ricky, but never meant to intentionally hurt him. Cathy and Ricky were both arrested. Detectives started to do some digging, and they found out that Ricky had a brother named Conrad who was missing. Investigators went back to search Ricky and Cathy's home to see what they could find. When looking in the carport of their home, they found a trash can that was wrapped with plastic and duct tape, and then encased in concrete. It looked very suspicious, and after they were able to get inside of the trash can, they found a deceased Conrad, who in fact had never been missing. Raul told detectives that Conrad died on August 22nd after he had been disciplined, and he made up the story of him running away with an older gay lover to hide the murder. Sick and twisted couple Cathy and Raul killed Conrad in Washington and traveled with his dead body on a car ride all the way to Southern California. They had been contemplating when to kill Ricky for months because he witnessed the murder of Conrad. After autopsies were conducted on Ricky and Conrad, it showed bruises and scarring from being hit with cords and burned with cigarettes. They sustained internal injuries, so the assaults were never a one-time thing. We can also all speculate as to why the autopsy report mentioned a scrotal sac being severely damaged. I could not continue reading about the injuries, but it is available if any of you could stomach what Ricky and Conrad had to endure. More witnesses came forward to speak with investigators about Raul and Cathy. Some witnesses said that Cathy treated Ricky like her personal slave and forced him to clean up after everyone in the house, including her two younger biological children. Her two younger children, according to witnesses, looked like they were in good health, well-fed and happy, but they could not say the same for Ricky and Conrad. During trial, Cathy tried claiming that she suffered from the battered wife syndrome and had no knowledge at all about Ricky and Conrad being assaulted. Also during trial, Raul admitted that he assaulted Ricky and Conrad, but swore that their deaths were accidental. The jury did not buy their stories, and with all of the evidence stacked against them, they were convicted of first-degree murder, and the jury recommended the death penalty. During trial, the court was made aware that Ricky and Conrad's older sister, Vanessa, tried to file for custody of them, but CPS and the courts did not give her a chance, despite her not having a criminal record like Raul. She was employed and had been attending technical school. She was quoted saying that Ricky and Cathy deserved the death penalty. I still think they are getting off easy with the death penalty, the way my brothers were assaulted for so long. But to me, they aren't even family. I don't feel bad for them. Raul's lawyer, Victor Marshall, said that Raul had no job, was emotionally unbalanced, and suffered from extreme stress, which caused him to lash out. He also claimed that Raul had a childlike mentality. During trial, they also read Conrad's personal journal. This journal expressed his issues with wetting the bed, questioning his sexuality, and how any time Cathy was having a bad day, she would take it out on family members. The journal gave prosecutors the chance to paint Cathy as the mastermind and the puppeteer who ordered Raul around. Ricky and Cathy were both sentenced to death. Cathy was sentenced on June 26, 2009, and Ricky was sentenced on July 2, 2009. To date, they have not been executed, and they are still sitting on California's death row at different prisons. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. Do you guys think Cathy is just as guilty as Raul? Let me know what you guys think in the comments below.